Hello, Chess.com. This is International Master David Pruess with the next installment of my series, Amazing Games for Beginners. So this game here, you know, is going to be amazing, and you know it's going to be comprehensible by beginners. Those are my only criteria. The game we're going to see today is Somebody Against Somebody. I don't even know these guys' names, but I know that this game rules, and I know that you're about to learn something awesome. So, let's start it off with a Nimzo Indian defense. And you've got white playing a3 to secure the bishop pair. And alright, and one of the things that you're going to see in this game is that black is going to be over eager to try and win this doubled pawn, because they start right away going after it with this move here, bishop a6. And this pawn on c4 can be very weak in the Nimzo Indian, and there are lots of positions in which it behooves black to attack it, and in fact to focus a lot of forces on that pawn. I spent a fruitless half hour today trying to wrench this pawn from Danny Wrench in a series of blitz games where I played black against him. And every time I was like one move away from taking that pawn, something disastrous would happen to me. And this game here is not a blitz game of Danny Wrench and myself. Don't worry. It is a more amazing game than that by a little bit. But it has a similar theme of black going after that pawn, and as soon as he gets it, something disastrous happens. But I would say he gets defeated in a much more spectacular fashion than I was defeated by Danny this evening. Alright, so basically the problem here in what black does is tunnel vision. He's got both tunnel vision about what he wants to do and tunnel vision about what white wants to do. Well, clearly this is what he wants to do. He just wants to come and take this pawn, right? And he's just pretty much ignoring everything else, right? Have you noticed him not really placing any pawns in the center, fighting for control of the center? Nothing, right? I mean, there's not really any theme that black's following other than trying to take that pawn. Do you see him activating his pieces? Not especially, right? He's only moving the pieces that can attack the pawn on c4. He's not connecting his rooks. He's not thinking about opening a file for them, right? So there's that single-mindedness. The other problem with black's single-mindedness is that after white played bishop to g5, black figured that there was only like one thing white could do after h6, kicking the bishop. He figured white would have to just trade off his bishop for the black knight. Okay, and assuming that there's only one thing your opponent can do and that it's going to be the simplest possible move, that's a certain kind of tunnel vision that you don't want to use in your game. So in this position here, white's move obviously gives black something to think about before just taking this pawn, right? If black just takes this pawn, what move do they have to deal with? Well, knight h5, but also just pawn to e5, right? And some stuff happens to the black king side. So in this position here, black thought, oh, I'll play like h6 and then I don't need to worry about the moves e5 and knight h5. So he played h6. But the second thing that I want you to learn from this game, besides black's errors in these first couple moves, is the theme that white used in this position here. Okay, white used a really, really important theme. It's a pattern that every master will have seen at some point, and a good number of non-masters will have seen as well, and it is definitely time for you to know about this theme. When your opponent attacks your bishop with their rook pawn, okay, in order to try and deal usually with this kind of arrangement where your bishop is keeping their knight from moving because of their queen, and it's also keeping their queen from moving, because if their queen moves away, you can do damage to their king side, right? So when you have this arrangement of the bishop, knight, and queen, it can be awkward for the opponent, so they will often try and deal with it by attacking your bishop with the pawn, which we call putting the question to the bishop. You're asking the bishop, do you want to trade, or do you want to retreat this way or that way? And very often retreating to h4 loses the bishop to g5. Certainly it makes g5 a possibility for black to get rid of this arrangement of the bishop and his queen if he wants to, right? So in this particular case, black was expecting, since white is losing a pawn, that white's not just going to retreat tamely. He figured that white was planning to just trade off. But there's another option that you often have when your opponent questions the bishop, if and only if they've already castled and you have not. Okay, because you need your rook on h1 for this option. Now, pause your videos for a moment and look at this position and see if you could have a more broad perspective on this position than the fellow who played black. Sort of be more thorough about what all white's possible options could be. Alright, do you see any interesting possibilities for white here? It could even be bishop takes f6. I might have been setting up a trick question, right? Is there maybe a follow-up to bishop takes f6 that makes it good? Or is there some other idea here for white? So think about that for a moment, and if you haven't figured out how to pause your video, I'm sorry, because I'm going forward here. White plays pawn to h4. This uses the potential of the rook versus the placement of the king. So it's a very, very specific pattern, but actually it comes up not infrequently. If white were castled queenside, this is also a theme which comes up, right? That since your king's not on that side, your rook is on that side, and you can usually play a move like h4 and allow this kind of piece sacrifice to open the file to attack the opponent's king. Now let me just show you the most basic purpose of this sacrifice if black takes it, okay? The most basic way that this mechanism works is you attack the knight. They don't want to just give back the piece that they won. They move the knight away, and now you usually need to be able to add another piece to the rook, and that would usually be your queen. And now you set up here, and you're going to give a checkmate. So black's going to capture your pawn, and you're going to checkmate him. Great, right? Okay, now there are, of course, some ways that your opponent could try and escape once they get into this situation. Here's the most important way they'll try to escape, and the move you almost always need to calculate is them moving their f-pawn. Okay, even if this rook could move, you see it wouldn't change queen h8 checkmate, right? Pretty much the only way they're going to stop queen h8 checkmate usually is going to be to move this pawn, creating a flight square for their king, right? So if you check him, he just gets away. And you can keep chasing him, but sometimes he'll get away. So one important thing to understand in chess is that when you're trying to checkmate a king, you don't always have to just check, 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 pursue it around, right? Often it's more effective to play a very fine move that cuts off his planned escape route, and then you'll be able to checkmate him in peace, kind of like a sitting duck, right? So what is white's move here? I'm sure that some of you have thought of it by now. Those of you who haven't, I would say this is a worthy puzzle for you. What does white do here to keep the black king from escaping? This is a very, very typical tactic specifically related to the theme I'm showing you today. So it's a very good one to remember. It's not just a random move. You're always going to have this pawn on g5 pretty much that you can advance to g6 because you just recaptured that bishop on g5, right? So these are all like typical pieces of a whole that are all going to come together whenever you have this pattern. So you play g6, you cut off the king's escape to f7, and now there's usually no way for the king to get out at this point. And this position here, of course, is an example of that, right? He just can't get away from the checkmate. So that is the most basic point of this, right? You chase the knight and then you bring your queen to h5 and checkmate on the h-file. But that's an awesome theme and definitely a good enough thing to learn to constitute a full video, but you haven't yet gotten your full entertainment's value. So I'm going to show you how this game actually ended. I didn't use an example that's actually that totally straightforward. Black didn't just take. So we're going to see like a more exciting and picturesque finish to this game. So This is also something which is sometimes called a passive sacrifice, in that like it's black who chooses to take, right? You don't have white taking on h6, taking on g7, and black's like, well, I've got to take, or he's just taking all my things, right? So it sort of relies on being able to put more pressure on the knight on f6, probably to get your opponent to actually take on g5, right? You need to somehow induce them to open the h file, because they're not being forced to take in the same way. So in the game, what white has done after h4 is they've reintroduced the e5 threat. So black decided to try and fend off that threat with d6. Now white's next move is a really, really spectacular and gorgeous move, and very, very nice and thematic. I really love this move. So here's another chance for you to test yourselves. If you're feeling good so far, if you've gotten some of the answers right so far today, you can pause your video and try and figure out what the best move for white would be next. If you found things challenging enough so far, just bear with me as I talk through it. So basically we want to put more pressure on this knight on f6 to get black to take, right? But interestingly, here's a move which would be wrong. Knight h5. It seems like the right idea, well-intentioned, right? You're putting your knight somewhere where it pressures this piece on f6, and that's exactly how I told you to try and force black's hand. But here's the problem. After black takes your bishop, and you take back with your pawn, and black moves this knight away, you find your own knight is actually, in an unusual way, blocking your own game and your own plans, right? And defeating you because you can't play queen h5. And if you can't play queen h5 right away and start threatening checkmate, these kinds of attacks don't work without any regard to time, okay? Timing's very important when you start sacking a piece to try and deliver a checkmate. You don't have time to move away your knight. Even if you sacrifice it away, you still don't have time, hoping to then play queen h5, because your opponent's going to bring out their queen to this area, and their king is immediately going to have decent defenses. So white's not by any means winning here. In fact, he is losing. So that's why knight h5 is a failure. It blocks your own h-file, right? And it seems like the right kind of idea, putting pressure on the knight, and it is the right kind of idea. But it's the wrong execution. So that's a discoordination of your own pieces when you put your knight onto the file that your queen and rook are supposed to use. So the answer is white finds another square from which his knight can put pressure on f6. So he plays this awesome pawn sacrifice called a clearance sacrifice, because what it's mainly doing is just clearing a square for one of your own pieces to use. It's not really damaging black. Black takes it without hurting his own structure or without bringing any new white pieces near him. All it does is allow the white knight to come to e4. Now, this is really spectacular and amazing because it looks like, white's like hanging this knight, he's hanging this bishop, he just hung a pawn on e5, he's really just giving everything up. And you'd be surprised to see, you can't take the knight now because of the queen, but as soon as you capture this bishop, white's just going to take back with his pawn, just opening this file, leaving the knight hanging as well. And if black took on e4, which they didn't, they would be up 2 pieces, right? 2 whole pieces extra. But after white's queen to h5 move, black doesn't have time to defend against checkmate. If he moves the f-pawn, what's white's winning move? Thank you, g6, cutting off the king, and now there's just no way around it. Queen h8 next. And if he cleans up the g-pawn first so that there won't be that g5, g6 move, then white just checkmates him. And you see why timing is so critical. Easily if black had one extra move at any point here, right, he could escape with like king f8, queen h8, king e7, or what have you, but there's just no way for black to escape there after taking 2 pieces. So black resisted as best he could, and that is to actually throw this knight away to slow white's queen from coming to h5. And this is better than just leaving the knight on f6, because if black plays some other move, then when white takes on f6, his bishop, not his bishop, but his pawn is actually getting close to the black king and constituting an extra attacker. So now white's checkmating idea is not only queen h5 to h8, but also queen g4 to g7, right? And this is just completely over. If you remove the pawn from f6 before it menaces you, it's just instant checkmate. A couple little variations to calculate there, I know. So black throws the knight under the bus, white takes it with the queen. Now notice white's not down a piece, right? And this is actually a typical pattern and something you should usually calculate before you play h4. When you play h4 in these positions, as white, you always need to also calculate what if your opponent throws the knight away to slow your queen down. Because you've sacked a piece, so you win back a piece, and then maybe they have a good move in this position. Okay, so that's something you do want to watch out for. So the game went d6, e5, takes, knight e4, takes, takes, throws that knight away, queen takes. And now black wants to try and make space for his king, so he desperately moves the f-pawn. White plays queen to h5. Now, what's white's threat here? I hope you would know by now. White's threat is g6, very good, to take away that square. Now, black has two moves. Is there anything he can do to try and get away during those two moves? So he can't play g6 to make more room for his king, because that is mate. So moving the rook gives the king the most room, right? But white cuts him off anyway. The king tries to run, and you may see that the king is not going to escape. Alright, so let's just quickly go over the two lessons I wanted you to learn from this game, right? The first lesson was black's tunnel vision in this position here, right? You see him moving his pieces to the side of the board, not even caring about the center, just focused on winning this one pawn. And you see when white plays bishop g5, sort of emphasizing that, you know, hey, I played e4 in the center. I'm the only one with the dark squared bishop. I'm going to try and make trouble for you on this diagonal because you don't have that bishop on e7, which is often a piece that black would have, right, with the knight on f6, pawn on e6, bishop on e7, right? I'm going to try and make trouble for black on the king side with all his weaknesses, and black just sort of thought like, oh, whatever, I'm just going to attack that bishop and he's going to trade it off, right? No sense that like his opponent might be up to something more than that. So that's the first lesson, hopefully important warning for all of us in terms of our thought process. The second thing I want you to see here is this really like nice theme that sometimes your bishop doesn't have to leave g5 if you have this rook, this pawn, and this king, right? And I got to show it to you in a very spectacular example where white gets to sacrifice extra material, right? The clearance pawn sack, beautiful. Knight e4, the knight on the hanging square, and if black had just like taken this pawn, the follow-up from white would be something like knight takes knight, forcing weaknesses in the black king side, and then bishop takes pawn with the idea of queen g4. And white is already going to be ahead at this point. So white does the beautiful sacrifice, even being willing to go down two pieces just to execute this clear checkmate. And I hope that some of you will remember this pattern of putting the pawn on g6 to cut off the king as well. That's a nice little bonus if you can remember that feature. Alright, hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. This is David for chess.com. Bye.